Well, good evening, Ron.
Good evening, Christopher. How are you doing today?
Good. Happy Halloween. By
And
the
to you
time
as
you
well.
folks out there are seeing this, it will in fact be All Hallows Eve.
Yep, trick or treating, my friends, trick or treating. And of course, you and I are unable to be here on Halloween. So this is kind of like a virtual reality thing, if you will. We are really not here right now, but we are new to you. So
We are speaking into the future. All
in
right.
the future, that's
So,
right.
uh, so yeah, looking forward. I'm looking forward to tonight's show. It's kind of a very special one for me because we're going to be talking quite about something that I've written extensively about and done a lot of research into, which is the legend of Sleepy Hollow, one of my absolute favorite folk tales and bits of Halloween. And so I'm actually looking forward to getting into that tonight. Now, Ron, have you read the original Legend of Sleepy Hollow?
I have actually, yes. And whenever I was a teacher, I actually even required that as reading because I think it's so essential to the understanding of not only how our literature evolved within this country, but also as a nice little snapshot of that particular time and place.
It really is. It's a travelogue in a way,
Mm.
of early post-Revolutionary War America, and it captures so much of that culture, which is something that I love about it. And it is, of course, I think, really the most iconic American Halloween story ever, if it's not specifically about Halloween, and I think kind of set the tone for Halloween. It's a longtime favorite of mine.
Absolutely.
And Now, for you folks out in the audience who have not read it, I imagine on some level everyone is probably familiar with the story of the Legend of Sleep, or at least the basics of it. You've got the tragic, or not tragic, but the very a classic love triangle between three characters. So the three characters who are the primary characters of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow would be Ichabod Crane, who is the awkward, sort of gangly country schoolmaster. He's very superstitious. He's very arrogant. You have Trina Van Tassel, who is this delightfully beautiful young 16-year-old girl who is the heir to the richest farm in all of the town of Sleepy Hollow. And rounding out the triangle, or triangling out the triangle, is Brom Bones, who's kind of the town bully, but he's also the town hero in a way because he's the big, strong, handsome guy who can, lift a horse to sweep underneath it. Just all muscles and not much brains. But these three are the central characters of the story, of course. And of course, if there was a love triangle with four corners, there would be the fourth character, and that fourth character would be the iconic Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, who is without doubt the most famous and most iconic ghost in American history. And really, I think the first great American ghost story, and one that I have loved ever since I was a little kid.
Absolutely. Yeah, it still scares me to this day, as a matter of fact. What's not more scary than somebody following you on horseback throwing pumpkins at you?
One of my favorite lines from the 1949 Disney animated version of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is that you can't reason with a man who has no head. And
Right.
so that it's a lovely thought, basically.
Yeah.
But
And
the story is it's 200 years old, actually 202 years old. It was published in 1820 originally. And I think most people expect that if they read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, it'll be all dry and difficult to follow, but it's none of the above. It's an incredibly charming story. And I think people have a tendency to imagine they've only seen the movie versions, or the cartoon versions, and see only the ghost story aspect of it. But as you mentioned earlier, it's a story that's kind of a snapshot of that period in time. It talks about the food of the Dutch Highlands and the Hudson River Valley. Of course, Sleepy Hollow is in the Hudson River Valley, just north of Tarrytown, New York. And they talk about the food and the landscape and the people and the cultures, and that's so much of what the story is about. And the ghost story kind of weaves through it a little bit and adds a little bit of spice to it, but it really is just a snapshot in time, and it's just such a delightful read.
right. So whenever I was in education, I would bookmark this with, or bookend this with Rip Van Winkle, which I think that these two kind of play out quite well. Because, again, it's a snapshot into that particular time and place. So.
especially the Dutch and German settlers who were here, who founded the Catskills and the North Hudson Highlands and things like that, and who kept a lot of their old culture much after the sort of the more Americanized. I mean, it was very early. This story takes place in right about 1799, or pretty close to that. But at that time, the Americanization of the people of this country was full steam ahead. But the Dutch people had held onto their language, they held onto their culture, and it really kind of changed the nature of the villages where these people lived. And they did kind of represent a little bit of a flashback in time. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. And of course, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow was written by Washington Irving, and Washington Irving is often referred to as the first great American man of letters, because we were a very new country at that time, and we were barely out of being British citizens. And the truth is that Great Britain at that time had published a lot of fantastic literature. I mean, you had Shakespeare and Chaucer and all of these classic literature that came from England. And so nobody really believed that America, this upstart new country, had any grasp of what culture was about. And Washington Irving was the first person to break that mold and actually gain the respect of even Great Britain, and have British audiences reading his work. So 200 years ago, when he published The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, it was actually part of a large collection of stories called the Sketchbook. And the Sketchbook, or the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, which was the full, very long name of that book. But it was a lot of different stories, a lot of different folklore. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow ended up becoming the breakout story in there. And it was written in 1819 while he was living abroad in England, then published in 1820. And I think it is Irving's masterpiece. It's a charming travelogue. It's a social comedy. It's a homesick love letter to his life in revolutionary, or post-revolutionary America. And there is just nothing about it that doesn't, it's a cozy story, and it's so much fun to read. And that's why I think it's a perennial favorite that has lasted for 200 years and will continue to go beyond.
Right. And he did a great literary device as well by going into the town and finding graves of people that were actually buried there that would fit the characters very well within the story. So if you would think about the folklore at that particular time, it becomes almost a biography more than a short story that's fictional, right? Because he's naming particular places. So it seems like you could go right now and visit Katrina Van Tassel's grave if you wanted to, up in Sleepy Hollow. So it brings that verisimilitude, I guess, right to the forefront.
And the fact that the locations in the story are all based on real places, the Old Dutch Church, which features in the story, the town of Sleepy Hollow itself, the river that runs, right past the church, all of these things, the bridge that crosses the river, all of these things were real landmarks. And so he wrote a story that had all of the real history of the place, and then wove it into his ghost story to make it all the more interesting and all the more, I think, intriguing. But the ghost story itself has been the part of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow which has kind of struck a chord with people the most. And of course, the story is the story of the legendary Headless Horseman. And his style of writing is absolutely so delightful. So he describes the Headless Horseman as the dominant spirit that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. The body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and the specter is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. How can you get any better than that? That is just such a wonderful ghost story. It is absolutely chock full of atmosphere. And again, he's got this wonderful, rich writing style that just immediately grabs you. And it's not dry. It doesn't feel like something that was written 200 years ago. You feel like a good contemporary writer, could have written this. And so that timelessness is, I think, a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I will tell you, a lot of things from this time period are rather daunting. I mean, a lot of this kind of literature is a mess to wade through. It's very prosaic, but really what we capture here with Irving is it's almost like a rustic flavor. It's almost as if he's sitting in your room telling you a story, right? It's that kind of writing. And I do urge anybody not to be intimidated simply because it was written in this particular time period, because I think you're going to have your eyes wide open about the kind of literature was put out in that particular period.
And Irving wrote quite a few great ghost stories too. He has there's a lot of ghostly stories like The Adventure of the German Student and the Spectre Bridegroom and things like that. Quite a few ghost stories that he has peppered throughout his So if you're into ghost stories and you're into stories of the supernatural, he did write a lot of them. Obviously, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow has remained the breakout of all of those, but it really he was very fascinated with ghost stories and with folklore. And you're right, it's both oddly accessible, but it's also what my friend Henry John Steiner, who's a historian down in Sleepy Hollow, referred to as a kind of an elevated English, a high English. It almost feels like an archaic way of speaking because he uses such rich structure in his language, and he does throw in some pretty chewy words in there. Some what I'd call $2 words in there, and those are fun because if you haven't heard them before, it's even fun sometimes reading something like that to actually have the chance to look up a curious term that you've never heard before and expand your horizons. So it's both accessible, but also kind of broadens the imagination at the same time. And what I think a lot of people always ask when they read a story like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is, if we know that the old Dutch church is real and we know that the bridge is real and all the names of the people are real, they often want to know about the ghost itself and how much of that might have been based on something true or something real. And that's a little bit of a complicated question because the inspirations for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow came from a variety of different places. So where in fact did Mr. Irving get the idea for his headless phantom? Some of them probably would have come from folk tales told by his Irish nanny, also local Dutch legends, and we're going to talk about a couple of those in just a moment, and real history from the Hollow itself. Washington Irving didn't grow up in Sleepy Hollow. In fact, Sleepy Hollow isn't an official place name at the time that Irving is alive. It's a village name, but it's a kind of a local name, and it was a true place. But the thing about Sleepy Hollow is it was a reference to the valley that was just north of the little sort of port town of Tarrytown, and it wasn't particularly densely settled. You had a few cabins and things like that. So it was an area that was very rural and very rustic and didn't get, the town of Tarrytown ended up spreading into that area later on. And it wasn't until the 1990s that the village of North Tarrytown, which was just an extension of the original Tarrytown, ended up reverting and using the old name of Sleepy Hollow and kind of became officially Sleepy Hollow. But the name has been a part of their history since long before Tarrytown existed, for literally centuries. In fact, it's actually probably based on an old Dutch word, Slapershaven, which means sleeper's rest or sleeper's hollow. And that's almost certainly the origin of the name of Sleepy Hollow, which is not surprising considering that it is all Pennsylvania, or rather German Dutch, that settled the area. So they would have named it after a place name that actually is in Holland. Slapershaven is actually a place in Holland.
Very cool. Very cool.
So among the legends that he may have heard when he was growing up, I would think would be some of the more well-known headless ghosts from Dutch and German folklore. His Irish nanny certainly would have heard told him some of these too, but the German and Dutch legends that might have connected to him may have come from the legends of the Brothers Grimm. For instance, Hans Jägenteufel. That's a heck of a name for you. Hans Jägenteufel, which literally means Hans the Hunting Devil, was a figure who was supposed to be a nobleman who was a wicked man in his lifetime. And so when he died, there's an old piece of folklore that I think is absolutely fascinating, that if a wicked person is not brought to justice in life, that after death, that they may end up being forced to roam the earth as a headless spirit, because if they basically weren't executed as a criminal in life, they were sort of had to take on that role in death. And so these headless spirits from German and Germanic folklore often were headless as a penance for their crime. They also often became these kind of wardens. We've talked in the past about the Wild Hunt and these other characters that roamed the night in Germanic folklore, and headless spirits were actually commonly a part of that. So Hans Jägenteufel was one of these, and his story is related in the Brothers Grimm. But I think one of the more delightful legends that comes from Irish folklore would be the Coach Bower. The Coach Bower meaning literally the death coach, driven by a headless horseman or a headless coach driver. And even, although not shown here, even sometimes the horses themselves drawing the coach are meant to be headless. And so a headless driver, potentially headless horses, and this coach will race through the night and collect the spirits of the dead. And so these were pretty common folk tales that almost any country person would know. And easily something that would have been influential with Irving, because Irving was, among other things, a voracious reader. He loved to read folklore, he loved to read history, and so he probably would have been familiar with some of these. But there is one particular ghost from Germanic folklore that he couldn't have missed, and that was the one that may have given him his initial sort of push to create the Headless Horseman, and that is a Headless Horseman from Germanic folklore called the Dullahan, which literally means the dark rider. I'm sorry, Irish folklore, not Germanic. I apologize. So the Dullahan is a dark spirit. He's one of the dark fae, or the dark she, never a truly human spirit, but he has the figure of a man mounted on a horse carrying his own head. That head glows with a corpse light, basically this sickly green light, which shines forth from both the mouth and the eyes, and any living creature caught in the light, the corpse light that comes from the Dullahan's head, is instantly killed, and the Dullahan scoops up his soul and takes it to the underworld. So once again, we have one of these underworld collecting spirits. There were an awful lot of those running around, and maybe one of the more gruesome aspects of the Dullahan is that he carried a whip made from a human spine. So it's an incredibly grim, very, very dark spirit, but I think one of the most fascinating spirits in old Irish folklore.
Yeah, it's fun too. That's a great boogeyman.
He is. He really is. And of course, the parents could easily use the stories of the Dullahan to scare their children into behaving, because if they were caught outside after curfew or snuck out of their room after dark and were seen by the Dullahan, of course, they would be carried away to the underworld, and no kid wanted to suffer that fate.
No.
So. So was there a real Headless Horseman? This is a good question. It's one that I get asked a lot, because when I do book signings and things connected to my book on Sleepy Hollow Legends, it's one of the things that people ask most often. And the interesting thing about this is that while it's absolutely certain that the folklore of the area contributed the basic ideas of the Headless Horseman in Irving's imagination, and I had actually started to mention this earlier, but it certainly bears a little more details, that Irving didn't grow up in Sleepy Hollow, but in 1798, New York City, where he did grow up, was actually under the grip of the yellow fever, and this was a very, very dangerous illness. It was a pandemic, and it was particularly dangerous to children. So his parents sent him away to the Hudson Highlands, to Tarrytown, where he would stay with family friends, the Paulding family, stay with family friends until the sickness had passed. So he spent a significant amount of his youth in the Hudson River Valley, specifically in Tarrytown, and wandering in the woods north of the town, which was known at that time as Sleepy Hollow. And he talks a lot about that in his writings. So a lot of Washington Irving's writings are actually real experiences from his life. But he would wander there. He would sit down with the old Dutch housewives, and he would listen to them tell their stories. And this is where a lot of this folklore came from. But there is one story that he almost certainly heard. Whether he heard it firsthand or secondhand, I can't say for sure, because in 1798, the very year that Irving traveled to and basically took up residence in Sleepy Hollow, there was a memoir published by one of George Washington's generals who fought alongside him in the American Revolution. So the 1798 memoir was of Major General William Heath. He's one of the most notable generals of Washington's army in the American Revolution. And Heath wrote this extensive memoir about his activities during the war, and a great deal of information about the first-hand experiences in the Revolutionary War dominate this text. However, Heath, sorry, I'm jumping forward on slides here, and I want to make sure we've got all the information here. Heath wrote specifically a great deal about the Battle of White Plains, which took place on October 28th of 1776. Now, this was an assault by British forces coming north from New York City, and they had managed to thoroughly rout the American forces and drove General Washington and his men out of White Plains into the hills north of it. And this was a pretty significant defeat for the American army. We were not, meaning we, the Americans, we were not doing well against the British at that time. The British had superior forces, they had superior training, and they were thoroughly kicking our behinds. And at that point, they also brought in secondary forces that they hired from other countries who had forces to let. So they had bolstered their army and basically made themselves a force to be reckoned with. So on October 28th, the Battle of White Plains took place, and that's just a little distance from Sleepy Hollow in New York, about 7 or 8 miles from Sleepy Hollow. And thoroughly routed the American troops who pushed back into the hills north of White Plains. And there, they basically hunkered down until they could escape, because they knew at this point there was no chance of winning the battle. They only wanted to escape. But they couldn't simply turn tail and run, because they'd open their backs to the British, who would pursue them and mow them down. So this had to be a strategic process. On the 31st of October, on Halloween, the British planned to attack the Americans. They knew that the Americans were hunkered down in an area called North Castle, which is just north of White Plains, and they figured that they had them at a disadvantage. They had them when they were sort of disheveled, and they were going to do one final assault and hopefully wipe out the Americans. But that night, October 31st, Halloween night, was a dreadfully stormy night, and the rain was torrential, and they decided they just simply couldn't go forward. They couldn't press the attack. But in the early hours of November 1st, the rain let up, and they thought this was their last chance. So they actually decided that they were going to push forth, and they were going to try to take out the Americans. Basically, it would have been just around dawn that they did this. So on November 1st, 1776, the Americans were hunkered down at Miller Hill. This was the right flank of the American forces. And while they were there, General Heath recorded specifically the British assault on them. And a really interesting piece of information. So he talks a lot about just military movements, a lot of fairly boring stuff. But one particular line is really fascinating. It says, a shot from the American cannon at this place took off the head of a Hessian artilleryman. They also left one of the artillery horses dead on the field, and what other losses they sustained that day was not known. Now, this is fascinating, because here now we have a first-hand account of a Hessian soldier, a Hessian artilleryman, it says, so basically heavy artillery here, having his head taken off just a few miles from Sleepy Hollow, and leaving even one of the horses dead on the field. Now, that's pretty fascinating if you compare it specifically to what Washington Irving says when he describes the Headless Horseman, said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. Now, sometimes people like to say, well, that's not a nameless battle. That's the Battle of White Plains. It's a very well-known battle. No, it's not. The Battle of White Plains was on the 28th of October. The battle was done. The Americans were desperately defeated, and now this was a skirmish that took place several days later that doesn't even have an official name. It's just sort of a little unnamed moment in history that most people forget about, and most people don't even realize that the monument is at Miller Hill that actually talks about those last few shots that were fired that were the end of the New York campaign. But here, for the first time, we have not just a Hessian soldier, but a Hessian soldier decapitated by a cannonball, left dead on the field with a horse. And it is perfect. It is a perfect analog of the Headless Horseman. And that memoir was published the very year that Washington Irving came to stay in Sleepy Hollow. So how can you get a better setup for a ghost story than that?
So does the Hessian soldier have a name?
He does indeed, and we're going to get to that, because it took me a little while to hunt that down, and I don't want to give away the ghost, pardon the pun, too early. I want to tell you a little bit about why the Hessian soldier was there, or the Hessian soldiers were there, because a lot of people aren't particularly familiar when they hear about it. In fact, one of the things that even in, I think, the movies, they often refer to the Hessians as being mercenaries. Mercenaries, usually the way we think of mercenaries today, we think of these soldiers who just fight for money, these unprincipled, clods who come and they'll shoot at anyone for money. That's not at all what these men were. These Hessian soldiers, they were German soldiers, but they were not coming for money. They were under the control of the various princes of the princedoms, these little mini sort of micro countries within what is modern day Germany. So Hessian soldiers from central Germany hired to bolster England's armies, but what the Hessians didn't get was any more pay than they would have gotten anywhere else. They weren't given extra pay for doing overseas duty. The only people who made money on these deals were the princes who controlled them. So these people were indentured soldiers. Basically, they were drafted into service, and they had to fight for the prince and go wherever the prince told them. So they weren't necessarily unprincipled, despite the fact that they were very, very well known for being incredibly disciplined and incredibly fierce fighters. So they were somewhat terrifying to the people of America. Americans who ran across the Hessians began to demonize them. They believed that these were these, inhuman sort of, monstrous soldiers that would, kill anyone for any reason. So they were very, very demonized. Not that the British British soldiers themselves weren't seen in a bad light, but the Hessian soldiers were seen as monstrous. So this was a really good setup for what would become really the greatest ghost story. But to answer your question, or kind of get onto that track about who was this forgotten Hessian soldier, well, that's what I wanted to know. When I stumbled across the journal of Major Heath and decided that I wanted to write this book on Sleepy Hollow, I thought, well, obviously we need to find out who this decapitated Hessian was. So I went to every scholar and every person, read every book I could on the subject of Sleepy Hollow, and the answer was just nobody knew. Nobody had any idea who this person was. And I thought, well, there's got to be a record. The man was in the military. If he was in the military, there has to be a record. So a wonderful historian that's a friend of mine and part of a paranormal group that I've worked with for years named Chris Beatrice, who's very knowledgeable on this kind of thing, was the one who turned me on to what I needed to find. I needed specifically to find the German muster rolls. The muster rolls, basically the troop lists. And so with a little help from Chris, we started to hunt down where they might be and found a college in Michigan that had a great deal of the muster rolls of these Hessian soldiers. And thankfully, or unfortunately, they did not have the specific ones that I was looking for. I needed specific dates and I needed specific regiments that were there. But with what the information they had, it gave me what I needed to find where the real records were, the complete records. And unfortunately, they were in Germany. And so Marburg, the heart of Hessian Germany, this is the absolute center of Germany, this beautiful old town that is just situated right in the heart of it. And that great castle you can see there atop the hill called Landgrave Castle is where these German princes would meet under the Landgrave, who was basically the prince of princes out there, and sell soldiers to the highest bidder. So a town with a great deal of history, and also a town which hosted the most extensive archive of Hessian records in the world. So I thought, well, that's all well and good, but what am I going to do? Jump on a plane to Germany and go find these records? And I thought, why not? And that was, within days, I had actually booked a plane to Germany and decided to go and hunt for these records. Now, I'm not going to claim that this wasn't a crazy thing to do. My German is minimal. I speak a little tiny bit of German, but I was full of piss and vinegar, and I thought that I'm going to go there and I'm going to find the Headless Horseman. And so that's where I went. I jumped on a plane. I flew to Marburg and decided to concentrate on the primary regiments that I knew were there. 3 specific regiments, the regiments of Lossberg, Kniphausen, and Rahl. These were the 3 commanders who basically oversaw the Battle of White Plains, and I knew that they had been there at the Miller Hill Battle. And so I had them put aside the records for me, got to Germany, and again, with an idea that I could find this information, I spread out before me these 250-year-old pieces of parchment that were handwritten by these original generals. And it was an extraordinary thing to hold them on my hand. But I realized immediately, as soon as I laid eyes on them, that I might have made a big miscalculation, because if you're finding those difficult to read, believe me, they were no easier to read in person. It was tiny, crabbed handwriting, tiny little numbers, and very archaic. And I didn't speak German to begin with. And so I was at an absolute loss. I was looking at documentation that meant nothing to me. And I sat there in this German archive and immediately believed that I had been thoroughly defeated. But I couldn't just go home empty-handed. And so I approached the archivist. And I have to point out, this is a little bit of a funny story, is that I have some high school German. So I have a tiny smattering of German. But like a lot of Americans, I went they're assuming if people are going to speak English. And especially in a college town like Marburg, in an archive where these are all educated people, I assumed that most of these people would have at least a basic command of English. And boy, was I wrong. So the archivist didn't speak a word of English. My German was halting at best. And so the process of pantomiming and translating using my phone to try to speak to this man was an amazing undertaking. But eventually I explained to him that I was hoping they could scan a few of these pages for me and send them to me. But just in case they weren't able to do it, I took out my phone and I started taking snapshots in quadrants, because these pieces of paper, they were not little, like, notebook paper. These were huge slices of paper with all this crabbed writing on them. And I basically photographed every single part of them to assemble later to see if I could make any sense of it. Figured I could at least come back with something. But to say that I was daunted and overwhelmed would have been an understatement. So basically, I left Germany believing that I had completely failed. And it was about a week later that I got an email from the archivist, and he sent me the documents. And these were nice and very, very clear. And now I had plenty of time to look at them. And as I was looking at them, I thought, I've just got to be methodical. I've got to go through these and do as best I can and try to figure out if there's anything I can piece together from them. And I had a couple of epiphanies. And I'm going to start by saying that I was able eventually to rule out a couple of the documents, but it was on a specific page. Now, I knew I had a date, I had a location, and that was a good start. And what I found is that the Regiment von Rahl, this was a Hessian Grenadier battalion commanded by Colonel Johann Gottlieb Rahl. And by the way, if that man in the picture looks a little bit like George Washington, that's a real painting, original painting of Colonel Rahl, and he is the man that Washington defeated at Trenton when Washington crossed the Delaware in the dark of night on Christmas Eve and attacked the Hessian troops at Trenton. It was Rahl who was in charge of them, so it was his regiment that it turned out I needed to be looking at. So I thought that was kind of fascinating, because the man bears, at the very least, a very passing resemblance to George Washington himself. But on those documents, I had been concentrating on the page that I showed before. This is the this is the distribution list for the soldiers. It said what regiments were where. It talked about the ones that were in charge, who the officers were. So it was a lot of information, and this is what I was concentrating on. But the back of each of these documents had looser, more casual-looking handwritten information, and it didn't look all that important. But just in case, I had him send it to me anyway. And there was one word that leapt out at me on the back of the Rahl documents, and it was a word that I didn't understand, but I had an inkling about, and that word was totgeschossen. Now, I had an inkling about it, and I also had a friend who spoke fluent German, and with his help, I quickly learned that totgeschossen meant shot dead. And I suddenly knew that I was on the right track, because now what I had were the casualty lists, and that was the single most important thing that I needed. So with a lot of squinting and peering, I finally noticed there were two pieces of information on the back of that page, which were of huge value to me. And if you look carefully here on the right-hand side of the page, you can see the two highlighted entries. The very last word looks like it says withplane, Withplaine, withplane. That's not a German word. That's a German interpretation of the word White Plains, or the name White Plains. And I suddenly knew I had something. So it turned out that these were the two men who were killed on November 1st in White Plains. And it was almost a eureka moment, but it was also maybe the moment that I dreaded the most, because there wasn't one person killed. There were two people killed. And how on earth was I going to figure out which of the two was the decapitated Hessian? And I thought, if I come back having gotten this close and can't solve the problem, I would have failed completely. And so I was distraught. I was absolutely distraught. I thought there was no way for me to be able to solve this problem. However, I couldn't give up that way. And so I looked and I did what I could. I read whatever I could, and I couldn't figure out the rank of one of them. There was up at the top of the list there, which I had up a moment ago, bring that back up, the fellow from Melsungen, and I couldn't figure out what his rank was. And so I kind of gave up on him. But the one below, a fellow named Wilhelm Gossman, his rank wasn't obvious to me, but there was one really curious looking word right at the beginning of the entry. And the word was tam, T-A-M-B. And to me, tam sounded like it meant something. It sounded like it was familiar to me. And I thought, what could that possibly mean? It sounds like tam, like a tambourine. And I suddenly realized that I did know what this guy was. And so Wilhelm Gossman was a tambour, or a drummer. And this, of course, very important military function. Drummers would be with battalions, and they would use the drums to set marching paces. They would use it to communicate information between battalions and everything. So the drummers were very important, but they were non-combatant soldiers. They were usually teenagers. They were kids, and they would never be mistaken for a combat soldier. And so that made him seem like a very unlikely Headless Horseman. But the other one, there was something different about the other one. So I couldn't figure out his rank, but I was able to see what company he was with. And so Heinrich Range was a part of the Lieb company, and that made him a grenadier. A grenadier, by the way, is a grenade thrower. These guys would keep a satchel at their side with clay grenades. These are like the old bombs in Warner Brother cartoons. It was a little round clay grenade with a fuse on it. You lit the fuse. It was a short fuse. You flung it into your enemies, and it would explode and take out a few enemies. But these were heavy, and they would carry a lot of them. So the grenadiers, especially Lieb Company, which was an elite force, these were big, bulky, powerful fighters, and these guys were they were the absolute best of what they did. So I thought this sounds like a very, very likely choice. So I thought, so now how do I kind of, what's my final game on this? How do I figure out that for sure this is? Well, it was fairly obvious, and it was what General Heath had said right in his very, very, right in the documentation himself. He basically gave me the answer. So Heath said, a shot from the American cannon at this place took off the head of a Hessian artilleryman. And they also left one of the artillery horses dead. And I thought, there's no soldier who doesn't take a certain amount of pride in what they do. And General Heath would have been no different than that. These men respected, they respected power, they respected force, and they respected certainly a soldier who was an excellent soldier. What they wouldn't be particularly respectful of is the idea of a teenage kid playing a drum. Those would have been essentially a non-entity to them. So for him to refer to this character as an artilleryman, he was obviously not referring to the drummer, and he would have known the difference because the uniforms alone would have been incredibly distinctive. Now, I'm not saying that a blood-covered soldier laying on the battlefield would be easy to identify, but the drummers had an entirely different livery. They had chevrons all up and down their arms, and they would have been incredibly easy to identify. So a small, slim kid carrying a drum, or an enormous, bulky combat soldier carrying a bayonet and a satchel full of grenades, there was no question the only person that it could have been was Heinrich Range. And Heinrich Range died on November 1st, 1776, which of course is All Hallows Day. And that, to me, is astounding, because you now have, of course, we all know All Hallows Eve, like Christmas Eve, is actually not the holiday itself. It's the night before. All Hallows Eve or Halloween, even though we're used to celebrating at that time, it's still meant to be the eve of the time. And so at midnight on All Hallows Eve, you go into this liminal time when the worlds are supposed to, so the difference between the world of the living and the dead gets blurred, and the dead can supposedly cross back and forth from the land of the living. And this is the time when, in old belief, especially, Celtic and old belief, that these spirits would be able to pass into the underworld. So the idea that this man died on All Hallows Day, to me, made him a perfect subject. He became literally the Headless Horseman simply by virtue of being killed at the wrong place at the wrong time of year, and maybe his spirit never was able to cross over into the underworld or slipped right on back. It's hard to say, but I think that that the Headless Horseman being technically born on Halloween, you can't make that stuff up. That is,
you can't get any better than that. Yes, good detective work there, Mr. Sherlock.
I have to tell you, it was I was incredibly proud of myself. That was the most detective work I've ever done, but I definitely felt a little like Sherlock that day.
Absolutely, yes, that's very fascinating.
So here now we have an actual Hessian soldier truly decapitated by a cannonball, left on the field dead beside a horse on All Hallows Day. This story would have had legs. This is the kind of story that would not have died out. People would have been fascinated by this. And by the way, the very fact that Heath mentions the death of a single soldier is in itself a remarkable thing. You have to understand that this is a general who would have been dealing with battalions. He would have had to deal with, all of the men that are out there, not deal with individual men. To actually remark on the death of a particular soldier meant that whatever happened, the decapitation of the soldier in this case, would have been something that was shocking to see, that left, an impression on everybody that was there to witness it. It must have been a moment that truly stuck in the mind, or he would have never brought it up, because literally, why would he mention one death on the enemy side when they would see those every single day? So clearly this story stuck in everyone's mind. And I think that that is why the legend survived. I'm not 100% sure that Washington Irving would have heard the story from General Heath's memoirs, although I think it's very likely he would have read them at a later date. I think it's most likely he heard it as another story around the fire, because remember, this event happened not in 1798 when Irving was there, but happened 20 years earlier during the American Revolution in 1776, 22 years earlier. So the veterans from those kind of battles, most of whom would have been local, would have still been in the taverns and telling these tales over and over. And imagine sharing the story of having been there the day that you watched that Hessian soldier lose his head to a cannonball. So the shocking story certainly would have been a terrifying fireside tale shared by local war veterans. And this is one of the ways that a lot of these veterans back then earned their keep. They were storytellers. They kind of, they talked about their glory days. It would get them free ales and free beers and things like that. People would buy them a drink and even buy them a meal just to listen to their stories. So it was very, very common to find these old veterans telling these stories in the old taverns. And imagine when they get to the part where they say, but that's not all, because the Hessian still rises every night and searches for his lost head. Ghostly rider leaving the graveyard each night in search of his head. Now that was a story worth telling. So you imagine the story of the legend of the Headless Hessian was all over the Hudson River Valley long before Heath even published his memoir.
Yeah. And not only is this good storytelling, I mean, these poor gentlemen were probably dealing with some sort of post-traumatic stress syndrome as well, too. So this is a cathartic experience for them as well, too, to keep on telling and retelling the story, I'm sure, as well.
I would certainly imagine so. So now we have what we would call the birth of the Headless Horseman, born on All Hallows Eve, and now having become one of the most famous, and according to Washington Irving, the commander in chief of all the ghosts of the Hudson River Valley. So he certainly took on a position of great significance. And to this day, if you're not already aware of this, of course, Sleepy Hollow is a very real place. But one of the stories that's always struck me as a little interesting, and one of the reasons that people sometimes argue against this particular Hessian being the correct soldier, is they point out that in Irving's recollection, the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth each night to the scene of battle. But this is the churchyard at Sleepy Hollow. And as I mentioned early on, Sleepy Hollow and White Plains are not the same place. It's about 6, almost 7 miles from the battlefield. So why on earth would they have taken an enemy combatant and taken him 7 miles away and buried him in a churchyard over there? And that's an interesting story, which I think I have at least a very plausible answer for. And it's a two-parter. The first is, why would they take him that far to bury him? But it really wasn't very far at all. On a horse, you could make it from White Plains or North Castle to Sleepy Hollow in about 45 minutes. If you had a horse drawing a cart behind it with the bodies of the dead on it, you could do it in less than 2 hours. And Sleepy Hollow, the church at Sleepy Hollow, known as the Old Dutch Church, which does still stand to this day, is one of the oldest churches in the country. It was built in the mid 1600s and it already had a churchyard there. White Plains was a much smaller town, may have not had a well-established church, but more than anything else, White Plains was also completely overrun by the British. So it would have been the American soldiers who would have had to take this body home, or not even necessarily the American soldiers, but rather the American locals. And this is an interesting thing, because a Hessian soldier, unlike the British soldiers who they called them redcoats for a reason. They called them the lobsters, because they had these vibrant red coats that were unmistakable. But the Hessians didn't. The Hessians wore blue jackets. They usually had a white sort of bandolier on them. They had red lapels and red cuffs. exactly like what the Americans were wearing. Now, this would be the American militia, who often wore whatever they had at hand, but the official conscripted soldiers in the American army wore a uniform that was so similar to the Hessian uniform that under ordinary circumstances, it'd be very, very easy to mix them up, especially when you're dealing with a headless body, because the Hessians wore these mitre caps, these giant conical caps that would have been very difficult to mistake for American. But without a head, covered in blood and gore, this body would have looked much like the American soldiers that they would have come out and found. And once the soldiers, the American forces, finally retreated, what would happen is that when the battle was finally over, locals came out, they collected the bodies of the dead, and they took them to the churchyard. And so I believe it's entirely possible that they may have taken the body of the Hessian with them, and not until later realized that this was the body of an enemy combatant, and still decided to bury him just out of respect for the dead, or even maybe not until after the fact. But I think that he was buried in the churchyard, despite the fact that that would have been a very unusual thing, specifically because he was mistaken for an American soldier. I think that that's probably the most likely explanation, given the uniforms that they would have worn.
That's exceedingly interesting. And now I kind of want to go up there with a spirit box and start doing some sort of EVPs up there and see what we can find out.
Well, I can take you to Miller Hill at some point, where that is considered to be the last shots of the American campaign, or the New York campaign, were fired. And I have a rough idea of where Heinrich would have fallen, even just based on the landscape of the area, and knowing that the German and British troops were actually just across the way from them at a place called Travis Hill. And from Travis Hill, where the Germans would have set up their cannons, their artillerymen would have come up the hill towards Miller Hill. So you can even get a pretty good sense of where the readouts were and where they would have found. So you have a pretty good idea of where the man would have fallen. But
we'll ask our listeners if they would like to see that, because that's something that I'd like to work out with you. Possibly in the spring, we could do a special Monday Night Monsters when we go up there, and we'll use your proficiency in German and try to call out to the spirits of the afterlife to see if they'll give us any kind of clues about what might be going on. I think that'd be an amazing thing. I don't think anybody's ever done it before.
I'm pretty sure they haven't. I have to say that when I was trying to hunt down the battlefield where this happened, and I learned about the battlefield before I ever discovered Heinrich's identity. But when I learned about the battlefield, I was surprised that almost nobody knew where it was, because people really hadn't paid attention to this secondary skirmish. This skirmish was so secondary to the Battle of White Plains, which had taken place 3 days earlier, that people just don't think about it. Now, if you go to Miller Hill to this day, as I say, there's a park there, and there's a sign up that indicates the presence of the park, but it's hardly visited. It is it's just literally a little park with a little sign and a little wooden fence. There's a down in the rocks that are down behind there by the woods, which is actually how you would head toward Travis Hill, where the British and the American forces would have been. But if you look back there, what you're going to see is a map that shows the lines of the battle, and a plaque that actually talks about the battle. But it's virtually forgotten. It's and the many times I've visited there, I've never seen another soul there. It's not common with tourists, I think, and so I think it's a largely forgotten battlefield. So certainly rife for new investigation.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I think that we should set this in stone. I would love to look at this on video as a viewer, but I'd also like to participate this as well too. So this is something we have to have happen.
Now, interesting thing about the old churchyard at Sleepy Hollow is that, despite the fact that legend tells us that the Headless Horseman is buried there, and by tradition, the locals, all agree that this is true, he does not have a gravestone, and he never has. Partially, this is because the story itself is still technically a legend, and there was never an identified actual Hessian soldier. And part of it is because, again, there was never any name for it. But I, to this day, very much hope, and I will continue to campaign. I've laid the groundwork for this. I'd like to see that the Hessian does finally get a grave at last. We now have the name of this Hessian soldier who died essentially forgotten, decapitated there just a few miles from Sleepy Hollow. And I think, and dying on All Hallows Eve to boot. So I think that it is about time for them to give him a gravestone, and I will be continuing to campaign for that, and hopefully finally get a gravestone for him. And I think, interestingly enough, some people might say, well, that's silly, he's a fictional character or something like that. And you know what? You can make a fair argument for that point. He's a fictional or folkloric character. But that doesn't make it unprecedented. In fact, about 2 years ago, the Old Dutch Church did something which I never imagined would happen, is they put up a gravestone for another character from Sleepy Hollow's folklore called Hulda. Hulda was a supposed witch. And the story of Hulda is that she was this woman from Bohemia, which is essentially, in the like a Croatia area, and that she came to America around the time of the Revolution. She was odd. She kind of dressed in a manly fashion. She hunted. So she was a very strange character and kind of off-putting to the locals, but she would trade with the natives and she would trade with the locals, bring them ointments and things like that. And people began to whisper she was a witch. And just like so many characters like that, they would use her services when they felt they needed them, but when they didn't need her services, they would treat her poorly. So she was ostracized and regarded as a witch. But Sleepy Hollow itself was in kind of the no man's land. It was in an area between where the American position was and the British position was. And so they got raided by both pretty frequently. But the British, on one particular evening, staged a raid on Sleepy Hollow. They would take cattle, they would take provisions and everything. And the people of Sleepy Hollow had had enough, and they gathered together with their rifles behind an embankment and started firing back. And who should show up with her rifle in hand but Hulda, the Bohemian, this supposed witch? And she fought right alongside the men of Sleepy Hollow, and she successfully took down a couple of British soldiers. But she eventually ended up being shot herself. And so when she died, the people of Sleepy Hollow realized that she had been one of them all along, and in a sense was a hero who probably helped them save their cattle and save their provisions that day. So they supposedly buried her in the churchyard. But just like the Hessian, she had never had a headstone. And about 2 years ago, the town finally decided that the time had come, and they actually put up a headstone for Hulda the Bohemian. So she is there, even though we cannot be sure that she's not only a folklore. They decided to honor her in the cemetery. So there is a precedent for it, even if you consider the story of Heinrich the Headless Horseman to be a legend. We know Heinrich himself is a real person. I feel like he deserves to be remembered. And so I am absolutely holding out hope that we will get a headstone for the Hessian.
Absolutely. May he rest in peace.
I think we know that he hasn't, and maybe until he gets his head back, he probably won't. It's very funny. I've always thought, it would be great to be able to find the head of the Headless Horseman and finally put him to rest. But you do have to imagine that if his head was taken off by a cannonball, that might explain why we've never found it. It's probably in pieces at this point. So,
absolutely.
Who knows? It may still be on that hillside somewhere.
Well, it would look really cool on your back shelf, sitting back there.
I know, but boy, I tell you, can you imagine how that would turn out? I imagine that I'd get a knock on my door from a man carrying a broadaxe and a bandolier.
That's right.
So, folks, it's just a few minutes before the turn of the hour here, and so I wanted to say that this has been a great, fun show. But I wanted, before we go, I want to talk a little bit about, if you are a fan of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and if you're looking for some awesome Halloween viewing, there's of course some incredible classic versions of the story. The one that turned me on to the story of Sleepy Hollow back when I was 7 or 8 years old, of course, was the 1949 Disney version, which is very, very faithful to Washington Irving's original story. This is delightful. It's about a 30 or 40 minute cartoon, so it's not terribly long. It has original songs sung by Bing Crosby, who does all the narration, and it is probably the most delightful and perfect version of Sleepy Hollow ever committed to film. And I have to tell you, while it's very cute and very sweet for most of it, when you get to that final climactic chase with the Headless Horseman, I got to tell you, as a 9-year-old kid, I thought it was absolutely terrifying. I thought it was one of the coolest and scariest things I'd ever seen. And I've probably, it created my fascination with the Headless Horseman, which extends to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember too. Yeah. Now, are you going to show more? Or are you going to show? Because I don't want to steal your thunder.
Well, if you want to say anything about, I don't know if you've seen that one. Again, that's, such a classic for me. And I think that it really is probably the finest version. But I have a couple of others I want to recommend. Definitely.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So of course, if you're looking for something a little bit more hardcore, leans a little bit more into horror. I think in the past, on a couple of our episodes, we've talked about Hammer Films. Hammer Films was a British studio back in the 1960s and 1970s that made some very garish and very bloody horror movies. And in 1999, very, very famous director Tim Burton decided to kind of resurrect the Hammer style and do The Legend of Sleepy Hollow as sort of as seen as a Hammer film. And so he created Sleepy Hollow, starring Johnny Depp and Christina Ricci, and of course a great collection of British character actors, and sort of recreated the Hammer style for this very, very bloody and but also incredibly fun adaptation of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now, if you're a purist, and I can be sometimes, you'll certainly realize in watching this that this movie, while absolutely great fun, bears no resemblance to Washington Irving's story. It is, it takes the story and it runs wild with it, with witches' curses and undead murders and all these kind of things. But it is great fun and probably one of the best modern Halloween films ever made, because it just oozes with Halloween atmosphere. So this has got to be one that you're familiar with, Ron.
Yeah, that's the one I was going to talk about. It's one of my favorites. It even has a little bit of steampunk thrown in there. It's very disorienting at times, but always beautiful to look at.
It really is. I mean, it's a visual triumph, and the storytelling in it is some of Tim Burton's best that he's ever done. Again, it has an amazing cast with people like Michael Gambon, Miranda Richardson, Ian Griffiths, and all these different wonderful actors, in addition, of course, to Johnny Depp in one of his most absolutely brilliant performances of his career. So one that I very, very highly recommend.
And Christopher Walken, who doesn't say a word, but is still
Christopher Walken, and a very strange turn as the Headless Horseman himself. Sorry to give that one away, but he's actually uncredited, in the film. But he actually he plays the Headless Horseman in flashbacks and that. So that one's a great fun film. But if you're not a fan of gore, you may want to give it a miss, because it does have some pretty bloody sequences in it. But it's a wonderful. Mm-hmm. And I would say, last but not least, a trio of fun binges. If you're looking for a really good binge for Halloween night, you may want to consider the Fox television series, which began in 2013 and ran for 4 seasons, called Sleepy Hollow. Now, this show was absolutely wonderful. It is delightful, especially the first 2 seasons, which actually focus specifically on the Headless Horseman. And this is one of the most bonkers adaptations of Sleepy Hollow anyone has ever made, because this story is about Ichabod Crane. Now is no longer this awkward country schoolmaster. He is a British spy. He's a British spy who comes to America and ends up turning coat on the British and ends up working for the Americans, and ends up encountering a Hessian soldier on the battlefield in 1780 and decapitating the Hessian, but being slashed himself in the process. The two both die. Their blood mingles, and then 200 years later, in modern day Sleepy Hollow, both of them wake up again, and it becomes this kind of bizarre X-Files like show with monsters every week and different plots and conspiracies and everything. And it's bonkers, but it's beautifully done. It's amazingly acted. The main character, of course, Tom Meissen, who plays Ichabod Crane, is wildly charming and such a fun breakout role. And it's such good fun. So if you never watch another episode, at least get the 2 first seasons in, and they tell one complete wonderful story full of witchcraft and monsters and conspiracies and the supernatural. And it's probably one of the most fun things that you're ever likely to watch. Have you seen it?
Oh yes, I have. Yeah, I watched the first season, I gotta go back and look at the second season then.
Yeah, the 3rd and the 4th seasons stumble a little bit. They change the direction of the show a little bit. They're still great fun to watch, but if you can only watch the first 2 seasons, it is so very, very worth it. So it's something that, again,
it's very well acted. It's kind of like the X-Files. Even whenever things are a little bit tongue in cheek, they're still on their game.
Yeah, it's got a great sense of humor about it. It also has the whole fish out of water idea, because Ichabod is from the 18th century, and now he's in the 21st century. And the performances in it, the cast are uniformly fantastic. The special effects are amazing, and it's just such a great looking show. So if you have not seen it before, I cannot recommend it enough. So So as we start to wrap up for the night, I do want to point out that, as I mentioned early on, if you didn't already know this, you certainly should know that Sleepy Hollow is a very real place. It's in on the Hudson River Valley, north of Tarrytown. It's a charming little town. It's obviously a town that is absolutely in love with its own history. So you can visit the Headless Horseman Bridge and the Old Dutch Church. You can visit the different historic sites. You can visit Washington Irving's historic home, Sunnyside, which are there, and it's absolutely worth visiting. But of course, in the event that you do end up going to Sleepy Hollow and experiencing the Sleepy Hollow atmosphere, just make sure you do not lose your head.
Christopher, this was a fantastic travel log that you delivered with us tonight. Jumping from, the Hudson Valley over to Germany and all of your adventures. But it was great listening to all this stuff. It was awesome.
Well, guys, we were happy we were able to bring this to you. Again, we are recording this a few days before Halloween, but you'll be watching this, one hopes, on Halloween. And so from Monday Night Monsters, we want to wish you a very, very happy and, of course, safe Halloween. You, and if you happen to have any little ones in there as well. But we will see you again in a week on the next episode of Monday Night Monsters. And so for tonight, we just want to bid you adieu and have a wonderful All Hallows Eve.
Ha 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 ha!